When I saw his toothbrush standing next to mine again, something inside me tightened. It was supposed to bring comfort, the sign that he was home, that I was not alone anymore. But instead, I felt like a guest in my own space. His suitcase stood at the corner of the bedroom, unopened. He kissed me on the cheek and asked how I'd been, like I was a colleague he hadn't seen in a while. I told him everything was fine. I always do. He never asks for more. We had dinner in silence, his fork tapping the plate like a clock ticking. I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, same woman, same eyes, but older, thinner, more transparent. He said he would be leaving again in 3 days. I nodded. I always do. But this time, something cracked. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there beside him, his breathing steady, back turned to me. My fingertips itched for something I couldn't name. I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a question I hadn't dared to before: what would happen if I stopped waiting for him to see me? And this, right here, this is where everything begins. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, I want you to leave a comment with the city you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever felt invisible next to the person you love? My husband's departure was not abrupt. He packed with care, folded each shirt with quiet precision, checked his list twice, and kissed me lightly before wheeling his luggage out the door. The house didn't feel empty when he left. It felt quiet, too quiet, like the calm after someone whispers a secret they know will change everything. The silence wasn't just around me, it was inside. I wandered from room to room that morning, tidying things that didn't need tidying, opening drawers and closing them again. I stopped by the bedroom and caught sight of myself in the mirror. Not bad for a woman in her 50s, I told myself, and it wasn't a lie. But behind the makeup, behind the well-brushed hair and pressed blouse, I saw someone whose presence no longer stirred the air around her. I had nearly forgotten he was arriving that day, the guest. The son of an old friend from university, here for a short stay during his internship in the city. I had offered our home because it felt like the polite thing to do. When he arrived, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. He stood at the door, suitcase in hand, and smiled with the easy warmth of someone who had not yet been taught to hide his sincerity. I shook his hand, told him to make himself at home, and led him to the guest room. He thanked me and complimented the house, the floors, the scent of jasmine in the hallway. I stood behind him for a second too long after he entered his room, then turned away quickly, annoyed at myself. Dinner was quiet but not strained. He talked about his studies, his interest in architecture, and the books he loved. I listened, nodding, contributing here and there. He was not trying to impress me, and that, oddly, made me more aware of him. His voice had a low, thoughtful rhythm. His eyes were calm but alert. There was something careful about the way he existed in the room, as if he were aware that it wasn't his space but still allowed himself to fill it fully. After he went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, my fingers resting on the rim of my teacup. The steam had long disappeared. My thoughts ran without aim. Not about him, not yet. More about the way I hadn't noticed how often I sat in silence, how rarely anyone filled this space with new stories. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. I didn't hear him in the kitchen, but when I went down, I found a note beside a fresh pot of coffee. Didn't want to wake you. Hope you enjoy this. I smiled, genuinely, something small inside me thawing. I hadn't received a note in years. Not since before the texts became brief, practical updates. Don't forget to lock up. Meeting went well. Flight delayed. Nothing that carried intention or warmth. He returned around noon, groceries in hand. You didn't have to, I said, a little surprised. I wanted to help, he answered, and again, I believed him. We unpacked together, and I noticed how his movements were unhurried, how he placed each item carefully, not just tossing them in. That night, we had dinner again, and this time, the silence between topics felt comfortable. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was a flicker of attention, a softness of presence, the way I found myself asking him more questions, laughing a little too easily at a joke that wasn't even that clever. When I laughed, he smiled as if he was pleased to see me do so. It had been a long time since someone looked at me like that, like they were glad I existed in the room. I caught myself watching him from the hallway as he read a book in the living room. He leaned against the cushion, head slightly tilted, brow furrowed in thought. His youth struck me not as something intimidating, but as something tender. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to charm. He was simply being. And that, somehow, reached me in a place I hadn't felt touched in years. Later, I prepared the guest bathroom with clean towels, some extra soap, and lit a small candle. I didn't know why I did that last part, it wasn't necessary. But something about it felt meaningful. He thanked me before heading to bed. I lingered in the hallway after he closed his door, staring at the empty space, my hand resting on the doorknob of my own bedroom. That night, my dreams were vivid. Not inappropriate, not even romantic, just vivid. I was younger, standing at a train station, waiting for someone whose face I didn't know. But I remember how I felt in that dream, open, electric, hopeful. I woke before dawn and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The window above the sink was fogged from the morning air. I pressed my hand against it and waited for the warmth to clear a circle. I looked out at the still garden, the damp grass, the patio chair with a cushion slightly crooked. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like the house was pressing in on me. I felt like it had started to breathe again. I poured myself a cup of yesterday's coffee, now cold. The bitterness felt right. Not everything needed to be sweet to be real. Upstairs, I heard a soft creak, his steps, maybe, or mine in memory. Either way, I knew something was beginning, even if I didn't yet know what it was. The morning began with a softness I hadn't expected. The sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a quiet light over the floorboards. I sat in the kitchen with my coffee, watching the steam rise in slow, graceful tendrils. My thoughts were scattered, like loose pages caught in a breeze. I hadn't slept well, not from guilt or anxiety, but from something more restless, like my skin was tuned to a new frequency. He entered the room quietly, barefoot, his hair still damp from a shower. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, nothing remarkable, and yet I found myself straightening slightly as he moved around the kitchen. There was something about the way he existed in the space, not demanding attention, but naturally filling it, that made me aware of my own body in ways I hadn't been in years. We exchanged a few polite words. I offered him eggs, toast, tea. He declined most of it, settling on fruit and black coffee. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It felt like an arrangement, mutually agreed upon. There were small smiles, shared glances. It was all so quiet, and yet my mind was loud with the awareness of him. After breakfast, I began my usual routine, watering plants, sorting laundry, wiping counters that were already clean. I found myself paying more attention to the mirror as I passed it in the hallway. I noticed the shape of my collarbone, the way my blouse curved at the waist. I adjusted my hair, not out of vanity, but out of something else. A wanting to be seen. He was in the living room, reading again. His concentration fascinated me. I couldn't recall the last time I had seen someone so immersed in something real, something printed and tangible. My husband had replaced books with screens years ago. I stood by the doorway longer than necessary, pretending to be looking for a pen. He glanced up and smiled, a quick flash, then returned to the page. Later that afternoon, we both ended up in the backyard. I was trimming the herbs, he was fixing one of the loose patio chairs. We worked side by side, not speaking much, but every now and then our eyes met. I wondered if he felt it too, that strange undercurrent. A pull that wasn't quite explainable, not quite logical. He mentioned something about architecture, about how even imperfect lines could create beautiful symmetry if you understood balance. I nodded, not sure I entirely understood, but affected by the way he said it. There was something in his voice, not flirtation, but depth. A desire to understand things, even people. The day unfolded in quiet intervals. We didn't spend it together in any orchestrated way, but our paths kept crossing, in the hallway, by the sink, at the garden gate. Each interaction left a trace, like a fingerprint on glass. I began to anticipate the sound of his footsteps, the weight of his presence just beyond the wall. As the afternoon light softened, I found myself in the guest room doorway. He had left it slightly open. I knocked gently before entering, carrying a small vase of fresh lavender. He looked up from his book and smiled again, that same, sincere expression. I placed the vase on the windowsill and turned to leave, but he spoke before I could. "Thank you," he said, simply. I looked at him and nodded. There was a pause, and then I left. In the evening, we had dinner together again. This time, I poured us both a glass of wine. I told myself it was just to unwind, to relax after a quiet day. He accepted it graciously, and we toasted without words. The clink of the glasses was soft but deliberate. The conversation moved easily. We talked about cities we loved, places we'd never been, things we wanted to learn. He listened in a way that made me feel like I was speaking truth I hadn't voiced in years. There was no judgment, no subtle competition for attention. He asked questions that weren't meant to impress, but to understand. I felt, for the first time in so long, that I was more than the roles I played, wife, hostess, woman of a certain age. I felt like a person again. The air grew cooler, and we moved to the living room. He chose a record, one of the old jazz ones my husband never touched, and let the music fill the space. I sat across from him, legs tucked under me, swirling the last of my wine in the glass. The dim lighting softened the lines of the room, made everything feel closer, more intimate. He mentioned a film he liked, one I hadn't seen, and offered to show me a clip on his tablet. I leaned in to look, and for a moment, our faces were close, too close. I felt his breath, warm and steady. He looked at me, not with expectation or bravado, but with quiet focus. I didn't move. I didn't speak. We kissed. It was brief. Simple. No words. No build-up. Just a moment, a shift in gravity. I pulled away, gently, and stood up. "Good night," I said, softly. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I walked up the stairs slowly, feeling every step, as though the floor itself had changed under my feet. In the bathroom, I avoided the mirror. I turned on the tap and let the water run too long. I washed my hands even though they weren't dirty. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't panicked. But something inside me had changed. A line had been crossed, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. Back in my room, I sat on the bed, staring at the lamp. I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend. I didn't reach for my phone. I just sat there, letting the quiet settle around me. The house no longer felt like mine, or his. It felt like a suspended space, a place between moments, waiting to see what would happen next. And I knew then, no matter what path this took, I could no longer return to the way things were before. The morning after did not carry the weight I had expected. I woke not with dread or regret, but with a strange sense of clarity, like something inside me had clicked into place, though I didn't yet understand what it was. My body felt alert, like it had been listening to silence for too long and was only now hearing the hum beneath it all. I moved through my morning rituals more slowly than usual. The kettle took forever to boil, the toast came out unevenly browned, and still, I found myself lingering in the kitchen, listening for footsteps upstairs. I kept my hands busy, folding and refolding a kitchen towel, but my mind circled around one simple fact: I had crossed a boundary. I had done something irreversible. I didn't know what he thought of it, or of me. And yet, I wasn't consumed by fear or guilt. There was something honest about what had happened, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Still, it left me unsettled. When I finally heard him descend the stairs, I braced myself. I expected awkwardness, hesitation, maybe avoidance. But when he entered the room, he greeted me just as he had the morning before. His face was calm, open, as though the air between us hadn't thickened with unspoken things. We sat across from each other, sipping coffee in the same quiet space that now felt entirely different. We didn't talk about it. I didn't expect him to. He wasn't the type to narrate or explain. That absence of dialogue was both a relief and a weight. The moment existed, unchanged, suspended in the air between us. After breakfast, I decided to clean the upstairs closet, a task I had been putting off for months. I needed the distraction. Sorting through old clothes and half-forgotten boxes gave my hands something to do, even if my mind kept drifting. I found a shawl I hadn't worn in years, soft and faded, and for some reason, I draped it around my shoulders and looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I didn't look younger. I didn't look different. But I looked awake. Later, I went into the garden to trim the herbs. The sun was mild, the breeze gentle. I lost myself in the rhythm of snipping, sorting, tying little bundles of rosemary and thyme. He appeared beside me quietly, offering to help stake the tomato plants. I handed him the twine and we worked in companionable silence. I caught myself watching his hands, long fingers, precise movements, a care in the way he handled the stems. There was nothing dramatic in the way we moved around each other, and yet every small gesture seemed to carry a new weight, a new possibility. I wasn't sure if it was in my mind or if he felt it too. I didn't ask. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner: grilled vegetables, baked fish, lemon rice. He offered to set the table and did so with care, folding the napkins neatly, lighting a candle without asking. We ate slowly, talking about films again. He mentioned one he thought I'd like, and I wrote the title down. He smiled when I did, like it mattered to him. When the meal was over, he stood to help with the dishes. We moved around the kitchen in rhythm, handing plates, rinsing, drying. At one point, our hands touched. Just a brush, but neither of us flinched. I don't know how long we stood there before I broke the moment by stepping back and wiping my hands on a towel. After he went upstairs, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the bookshelves. My eyes drifted over the spines, titles I had loved, others I had forgotten. My gaze landed on a collection of essays my husband had given me years ago. I pulled it down, opened to a random page, and tried to read. But the words didn't stay. My mind wandered. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. Not because I had dismissed the importance of what had happened, but because I understood it differently than I would have years ago. I wasn't chasing romance. I wasn't trying to recapture youth. What I felt wasn't fantasy, it was attention, presence, being seen again. And I hadn't realized how starved I'd become for that. Upstairs, I heard the floorboards creak. Not pacing, just ordinary movement. Life continuing. I turned off the lamp and climbed the stairs, taking each step slowly, as though measuring the weight of what I carried with me. When I passed his door, it was open just a sliver. Enough for light to spill into the hallway. I didn't pause. I didn't look in. I simply walked past and closed myself into my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the chair in the corner where I had left my sweater. The shawl still hung around my shoulders. I pulled it tighter. I thought of my husband, of the life we had built. The routines, the vacations, the shared bank accounts and birthdays. None of it felt false. None of it felt broken. But something essential had gone missing over time, the part where you feel like someone is really looking at you when you enter a room. That part had faded slowly, so gradually I hadn't even noticed until someone else looked at me that way. I wasn't ready to name what was happening. I wasn't even sure there was a name. It wasn't an affair in the traditional sense. It wasn't about desire or conquest. It was about recognition, a reminder that I was still here, still whole, still capable of being affected. That night, I left the window slightly open. The breeze moved the curtains gently, and I listened to the distant sounds of the neighborhood, a barking dog, the hum of a passing car, a faint laugh somewhere down the block. The world continued, indifferent to my quiet shift. And I lay there in the dim room, not reaching for answers, but resting in the fact that something had awakened. Something real. I didn't sleep much. But I didn't mind. For the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't in years, not certainty, not peace, but something far more dangerous and vital. I felt alive. The next morning brought with it a certain weight. Not heaviness, exactly, but density, as though the air in the house had thickened, as though everything I did was just slightly more difficult, more considered. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if rushing through anything might break the fragile stillness that had settled between us. It wasn't discomfort, not really. It was something more like tension held in balance, a string stretched taut, not yet snapping. I spent the early hours alone. I opened the windows wide and let the soft breeze move through the rooms. The air smelled of damp earth and early sunlight. Outside, the world continued in its usual rhythm, birds chirped, a neighbor's sprinkler clicked on, a delivery truck hummed past. The ordinariness of it all felt strange, as though I was watching it from the outside. He came down later than usual. I was at the kitchen table, flipping through an old gardening book I hadn't touched in years. He offered a quiet good morning, to which I responded with a nod. We didn't speak much, but our silences had begun to take on a different tone. Not awkward or evasive, simply aware. After a quick breakfast, he asked if he could use the laundry machine. I showed him how it worked, pointing out which setting was best for what. We stood close in the narrow space of the laundry room, the scent of detergent hanging in the air between us. When our arms brushed, we didn't flinch. We just moved around each other like two people used to proximity, but not entirely sure what to do with it. Once he'd started his laundry, he returned to the living room, and I disappeared into the study. I tried to focus on some bills, letters, things that needed attention, the adult scaffolding of life. But my mind kept drifting. I couldn't stop replaying the night before last in my head. Not the kiss itself, but everything around it, the silence before, the moment after, the way we'd looked at each other without needing to speak. At lunchtime, we both pretended to be busy. I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, chopping vegetables I wasn't even sure I'd cook. He took a long phone call on the patio, pacing in slow circles. I couldn't hear his words, but I noticed the change in his posture, shoulders relaxed, one hand in his pocket, eyes toward the garden. He looked calm. Unbothered. When I finally made a simple salad, I called out that there was food if he wanted any. He joined me at the table and thanked me politely. We ate quietly, but every now and then I caught him glancing at me. Not staring, just observing, as though trying to read something between the lines of my face. After the meal, he offered to do the dishes. I let him. I watched as he moved around the kitchen with ease, as though he'd been living here for longer than a few days. There was something quietly intimate about it, about sharing space with someone who didn't demand anything from you, who simply coexisted. Later that afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. The day was warm but not unpleasant. I needed movement, needed to feel my body in motion. I left a note, not expecting him to join me. But as I reached the end of the block, I heard footsteps behind me. He caught up, slightly out of breath, and asked if I minded some company. I said no. We walked in silence for a while. The neighborhood was still, the sidewalks shaded by trees whose leaves had begun to shift toward early autumn. We passed small houses, some with children's toys scattered across the lawn, others with carefully tended flower beds. Everything felt ordinary and far away. Eventually, we reached the edge of the park. There was a bench near the path, half in sun, half in shadow. We sat without speaking. A breeze moved through the branches above us, scattering light like water on the ground. I folded my hands in my lap and stared ahead. He broke the silence first, but not with a question or a statement. Just a simple comment about the weather, how the season was beginning to turn. I responded in kind. Nothing heavy, nothing pointed. But between those sentences, I felt something settle. As though we had agreed, silently, to let things be whatever they were. When we walked back, we didn't rush. Our steps matched naturally, and though our arms didn't touch, there was a closeness that required no explanation. When we reached the front steps, he paused and looked at me. I looked back, holding his gaze for just a moment longer than I should have. Then I turned and opened the door. The rest of the evening passed without ceremony. We moved through the house like familiar shapes, he reading on the sofa, me preparing tea. At one point, I noticed we had both gravitated to the same room, him on the couch, me in the chair across from him. We sat like that for a long time, saying little, listening to the soft music I had put on earlier. Time stretched and folded around us, unhurried. Before bed, I lingered in the hallway, unsure whether to say goodnight or just disappear upstairs. He looked up from his book and offered me a gentle smile. I returned it and turned toward the stairs. In my room, I changed slowly. Not with vanity, but with thought. I brushed my hair longer than necessary. I moisturized my hands. I turned off the overhead light and let the lamp cast a warm glow around the room. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, uncertain of what any of it meant. I heard his door close softly across the hall. A quiet thud, final and light at the same time. I stared at my own door for a long time, then lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The air felt still, thick with unspoken truths and choices not yet made. What had started as a simple act of hospitality, offering our guest room to a young man I barely knew, had shifted the ground beneath me. It hadn't destroyed anything, hadn't upended my world in an explosive way. But it had peeled something back, revealed a part of myself I thought was gone. I wasn't chasing him. I wasn't pretending he was someone else. What I felt wasn't fantasy. It was real and quiet and dangerous in its subtlety. And I didn't know where it would lead. That morning, the house seemed to hum differently. The rhythm of our days had shifted so gradually that it was difficult to pinpoint when it happened, but now I could feel it, in the quiet steps, the exchanged glances, the way I lingered a little too long near where he sat. There was no plan, no intention. Just a pull, a soft, persistent, and quietly consuming. He came into the kitchen while I was slicing peaches. The light from the window lit up the counter and touched his face, and for a second I froze, knife in hand, watching how naturally he belonged in that moment. He smiled and reached for a mug, brushing past me, close but not touching. My breath caught, and I stepped slightly to the side, composing myself. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The morning unfolded in its usual rhythm. I busied myself with small tasks, folding laundry, cleaning out drawers I had ignored for years, dusting corners that hadn't seen attention in months. I told myself it was productive, but I knew it was avoidance. If I stopped moving, I would have to feel everything at once, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. He spent the morning outside, sitting on the porch with his laptop and a pile of books. I caught glimpses of him through the window as I passed by, and each time, I had to resist the urge to go out and say something, anything. I didn't. I let the space be what it was. At lunchtime, I made sandwiches and set them on the table without a word. He joined me a few minutes later, and we ate together in silence, broken only by the occasional sip or clink of a glass. It wasn't awkward. It was something quieter than comfort, a kind of stillness I hadn't known I needed. After lunch, he offered to help me sort through the garage, a task I'd been putting off for years. We spent hours going through old boxes, decorations from holidays long past, childhood toys, forgotten photo albums. We sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, flipping through images of people frozen in time. There were pictures of me, younger, laughing, holding my husband's hand. I smiled faintly, unsure if the sadness I felt was nostalgia or something more complicated. He held up one photo, a summer barbecue, and asked who the people were. I told him stories, not just names. He listened with interest, asked questions with a warmth that made me feel like I mattered. At one point, I laughed too loudly at my own memory, and he laughed too, not at the story but at my laughter. It caught me off guard. We stayed there longer than necessary, until the daylight faded and the garage felt cool. I stood up, brushing dust from my pants, and he reached out instinctively to help steady me. His hand on my elbow was light, respectful, but it lingered just half a second longer than it needed to. Inside, I started dinner while he went to shower. I changed into a dress I hadn't worn in years, nothing dramatic, just soft and simple, something that made me feel more like myself. As I stood in the mirror adjusting the neckline, I saw a woman who had been forgotten, by time, by routine, perhaps even by herself, but not lost. Dinner was quiet again. We sat across from each other with soft music playing in the background. I told him about my favorite authors, the ones I never admitted to liking because they weren't serious enough for my husband's tastes. He listened without judgment, without interruption. Just listened. That alone made my voice steadier. As we cleared the table, our hands brushed once again. This time, we didn't pull away. I made tea, and we sat in the living room, not side by side but not far apart either. The space between us felt charged, like the moment before a storm, not threatening, just heavy with possibility. I felt my fingers fidgeting with the edge of my sleeve, a habit I hadn't had in years. He noticed but said nothing. There was a pause, long and full. I looked at him. He looked back. And without another word, without build-up, without fanfare, we kissed. We kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't cautious. It just happened, quietly, simply, like breathing. And then I stood. I didn't say anything. I didn't explain. I walked up the stairs slowly, each step measured, unsure of what I felt, unsure of what came next. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my heart not racing, but steady, unnervingly steady. In the mirror, I didn't look like someone having an affair. I didn't look reckless or passionate or guilty. I looked like someone who had remembered something she thought was gone. And that memory, of being seen, of being chosen, of being present, was all over my face. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers tracing patterns on my knee. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't euphoric. I wasn't even thinking about what this meant. I was just there, in the stillness, in the weight of what had just passed between us. Outside, I heard the wind pick up slightly. The curtains moved gently, and the lamp's shadow shifted across the wall. The house didn't feel changed, and yet I knew it was. Not in structure, but in texture. Something unspoken now lived in its quiet corners. I lay back on the bed, fully clothed, eyes open to the darkened ceiling. I didn't try to make sense of anything. I didn't try to predict tomorrow. I just let myself be. The following morning arrived with the same gentle light and familiar quiet, but nothing felt quite the same. The walls seemed to hold on to sound differently, as if they remembered what had passed between us. I moved through the kitchen slower than usual, letting the kettle whistle a little longer than necessary, letting the silence stretch. He entered without hesitation, barefoot and slightly disheveled, as though the line between guest and inhabitant had completely dissolved. He offered a quiet greeting, and I nodded in response. We didn't speak of what had happened. We didn't need to. There was no need to define or explain. It lived between us now, in the way our movements adjusted to each other's presence, in the way the room seemed smaller when we shared it. I poured his coffee without asking how he liked it, I already knew. He took it without needing to thank me, he already had. We sat across from each other at the table, the morning sun warming the wooden surface between us. He looked out the window, and I looked at him looking out the window. I studied the slope of his neck, the curve of his jaw, the quiet composure he carried so naturally. There was no discomfort in his posture, no hesitation in his hands. That calm steadiness was what drew me in, what made everything feel both dangerous and safe. After breakfast, we slipped back into separate tasks. I worked in the study, sorting through old paperwork and receipts, and he remained in the living room, reading. At times, I caught the sound of a page turning, or his foot tapping the floor in a slow rhythm. I found myself comforted by the subtle reminders of his presence. Midday came and went uneventfully. I wasn't hungry, so I skipped lunch. He made himself something. I heard the cupboard doors open and close, the refrigerator hum, the clink of a spoon against a bowl. I didn't interfere. I didn't hover. But I listened, unconsciously tracking his movements through the house like a pulse. At some point, I went out to the garden. The sun was high, and the air was warm without being oppressive. I pruned the lavender, trimmed the edges of the walkway, swept leaves that hadn't yet had time to gather. I needed the rhythm of it, the simple, repetitive movements that kept my thoughts from spiraling. He joined me after a while, saying nothing, just picking up a pair of gloves and kneeling beside the raised bed. We worked in tandem, occasionally passing tools between us, occasionally meeting each other's eyes. Once, our fingers brushed over the same pair of shears, and neither of us moved away quickly. The moment passed without comment. When we were done, we sat side by side on the edge of the wooden planter box. We were dusty and warm, the scent of rosemary and sun-soaked soil lingering between us. My hands rested in my lap, still gloved, and his legs stretched long in front of him. The silence wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. I looked at him, waiting for something, not words, necessarily, but maybe a shift, an acknowledgement. He didn't turn. He just sat there, letting the sun paint lines along his arms, his expression unreadable. Inside, we cleaned up separately. I lingered longer in the bathroom, letting the water run over my arms and neck, watching the dirt swirl down the drain. I examined my face in the mirror, as if it might offer some kind of guidance. But it only reflected what I already knew: I had changed. In the late afternoon, I suggested we take a short drive, an errand, I claimed, though I didn't really need anything. He agreed without question. We rode in silence for the first few minutes, the road winding between familiar buildings and shaded trees. The air in the car felt still, held tight between us. We passed the lake on the way back, the one just outside town. On impulse, I turned off the main road and pulled into the small parking area. The lot was nearly empty. I parked beneath a tree, and we sat there for a moment before either of us moved. I stepped out first, and he followed. We walked down the narrow trail that led to the water's edge, where reeds swayed gently and ducks floated lazily near the bank. The sunlight danced across the ripples, and the breeze carried the scent of wet earth and distant pine. We stood quietly for a long time, watching the water, not touching, not speaking. Then he sat down on the edge of the dock, letting his legs dangle over the side. I joined him, careful to leave a small gap between us. Not too much. Just enough. The sky slowly began to change, clouds thickening and dimming the light. I glanced at my watch and realized we'd been there for nearly an hour. I stood and brushed off my dress. He stood too, mirroring me. As we walked back to the car, our shoulders nearly touched. That evening, I made dinner again, something simple and warm. He offered to help, and I let him. We moved around each other easily now, like dancers who had learned the steps of a new routine. No one led. No one followed. It was just flow. The meal was quiet, as most were. But this time, the silence carried a kind of agreement, not to rush, not to label, not to disturb what had begun to unfold. After the plates were cleared, we didn't drift apart into different rooms. We stayed in the same space, not speaking, just being. Later, I brought him a folded blanket without explanation. He took it with a small nod, a soft thank you, and laid it over his lap as he settled into the couch. I sat across the room in the armchair, the lamp casting shadows between us. Nothing else happened that night. No kiss. No touch. Just presence. And yet, when I climbed the stairs to bed, I felt heavier than ever. Not with guilt, but with knowing. The morning was still and pale when I opened my eyes. There was a slight ache behind them, the kind that comes not from lack of sleep but from thinking too long and too hard. My bedroom felt cooler than usual. The windows had been left cracked open overnight, and the breeze had swept in with the scent of damp soil and distant blossoms. The sheets felt soft, unfamiliar. Or perhaps it was me who was unfamiliar in them. I lay there for a few minutes, motionless, letting my body adjust to the quiet. The weight of what lingered between us, what had accumulated over days and silences, was no longer something I could push aside. It was a presence in the house, in the corners of the kitchen, in the hallway between our rooms, in the way the air seemed denser when we passed one another. Downstairs, I moved as I always did, made coffee, opened the windows a bit wider, straightened the cushions on the couch. The ordinary things. My hands performed these tasks without instruction, but I was inside myself more than usual, observant, deliberate, aware of every breath. He came in as I was pouring the coffee, still barefoot, wearing a soft navy t-shirt and gray sweatpants. His hair was a little messy, and his voice was quiet when he greeted me. It wasn't awkward. Not hesitant. Just softer. We moved around the kitchen like we always had, but every motion felt like it carried something beneath it, a memory, a possibility, a question that had not yet been asked. When our hands touched as he reached for a spoon, neither of us looked up. After breakfast, we didn't drift apart as we had on previous mornings. Instead, we ended up on the back porch, sitting a few feet apart with mugs still warm in our hands. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the threat of rain. We watched the wind move the trees in slow waves. No words were exchanged, but we sat there a long time, not needing them. Eventually, he spoke, a simple suggestion: we should drive somewhere. Not far. Just out. Get away from the house for a bit. I nodded. There was no reason not to. I changed into jeans and a cotton shirt, tied my hair loosely, and met him at the door. We didn't say where we were going. I let him drive. The roads wound through stretches of farmland and old neighborhoods, quiet places with little motion, until we reached a town I had visited once before, many years ago. He parked near the town square. The streets were lined with small shops and cafes, and everything seemed slower here, as though even time paused to breathe. We walked without aim. We browsed bookshelves in a dusty second-hand store. We shared a sandwich at a cafe. We pointed out architecture we liked and laughed at an old man feeding pigeons who seemed to be talking back to him. There was something surreal about being with him there, in public, in daylight, away from the shadows of our home. We weren't anyone to the people passing us, just two figures moving together through the world. But I knew who we were to each other, and that knowledge colored everything. On the drive back, it started to rain. Soft at first, then heavier. The rhythm of it against the windshield was soothing. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting myself drift into the sound. When I opened them, he glanced at me briefly before turning his eyes back to the road. Nothing was said, but something had passed between us again, silent and sure. When we returned home, the house welcomed us like it had missed our absence. The rooms were dimmer now, the rain casting shifting shadows across the floors. I went upstairs to change into dry clothes, moving slowly, methodically, as though the weight of the day had settled into my shoulders. Later, he was in the living room, reading again. I passed by once, twice, before finally sitting across from him. He looked up, held my gaze, and then returned to his book. I watched him turn the pages, the way his fingers moved, the steady rise and fall of his chest. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. As the evening unfolded, a quiet expectancy built around us. The storm outside had slowed to a drizzle, tapping lightly on the windows. I stood to close them, one by one, the room growing warmer with each turn of the latch. When I turned back toward him, he was standing too. There was no plan. No ceremony. We simply stood facing each other for a moment before I crossed the space between us. No words were exchanged. There was no preamble, no tension. Only stillness. We spent the night together. It happened gently, without urgency, without noise. It was not an explosion, not a whirlwind. It was quiet. Focused. Something almost reverent. In the early hours, I woke briefly, his hand resting near mine. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched the shape of his shoulders rise and fall with sleep and allowed myself, for that moment, to exist without questions or fear. When I slipped out of bed and made my way to my room, the house was silent except for the fading sound of rain. I closed my door behind me, leaning against it in the dark, breathing slowly. I didn't sleep again. I sat at the edge of my bed and listened to the wind, to my thoughts, to the truth of what I had allowed to unfold. There was no one to tell. No confession to make. But the echo of it, what we had done, what I had chosen, was everywhere. And still, I felt no regret. Only something like surrender. The morning after was quieter than any before it. Not because of what had happened, but because of what no longer needed to be said. I woke early, still dressed, sitting upright at the edge of my bed. My body was stiff, but not from sleep, from staying still too long, from listening to every sound in the house as the sky lightened. The hush that followed us now was a different kind of silence. It wasn't born of avoidance or shame. It simply existed, a layer of calm over something deeper. I washed my face, brushed my hair, chose simple clothes, and descended the stairs slowly, unsure of what I'd find. The kitchen was empty, but warm, the smell of toast in the air, a half-full mug on the table. He had already been here. I poured myself coffee, even though I didn't want any. I needed something in my hands. When he returned from the yard, I assumed, he entered as if nothing unusual had passed. He greeted me as he always had. I replied with a nod, then looked back down at the newspaper I wasn't reading. We both knew the weight of what lived between us now, but neither of us tried to put it into words. What could be said that wouldn't unravel the fragile balance we had found? The morning passed as most did, quiet, routine, deliberate. he offered to run errands in town. I said nothing at first, then eventually handed him a small list of things we didn't urgently need: fruit, tea, batteries. He left with a slight smile, not pressing for conversation. The door clicked softly behind him. I sat in the living room with the curtains open, letting the light filter in. The rain from the previous day had washed the world clean, and everything outside shimmered slightly: the leaves, the grass, the rooftops. I rested my hands in my lap and stared out the window for a long time. There was a strange comfort in knowing the world continued, untouched by what had shifted within the walls of this house. When he returned, the groceries were unpacked without ceremony. We stood side by side in the kitchen, organizing shelves and placing fruit in bowls. There was something almost domestic in it, and the normalcy of that scared me more than anything else. This ease, this rhythm, it wasn't temporary. It had settled into my bones. Later that afternoon, I chose to clean the guest room. I told myself it was just a task, something to do. But as I moved through the room, smoothing the blankets, dusting the shelves, I realized I wasn't preparing it for his departure. I was preserving something. A version of space that had become shared. He entered once while I was folding towels. His gaze swept the room, then met mine briefly. He didn't linger. He said nothing. But I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, that he understood what I was doing, and why. In the evening, I cooked. Not out of duty or hunger, but from a desire to create. The kitchen filled with the scent of rosemary and garlic, the quiet clatter of pans, the simmering of sauce. He stayed nearby, but not too close, sitting at the small table in the corner with a book open, watching me with the occasional glance. We ate in near silence, but it wasn't strained. There were brief exchanges about the food, the day, the weather. But they floated lightly, never dipping into anything heavier. We both knew how fragile it all was now, and neither of us was ready to disturb it. After dinner, he offered to wash the dishes. I agreed and stepped away, leaving the soft sound of running water and clinking plates behind me. I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of my bedroom, looking at the bed, the neatly arranged pillows, the folded sweater at the foot. I didn't feel guilt. I felt awareness. The kind that settles in the chest and doesn't leave. When I came back down, he was in the living room again. The record player hummed a quiet tune, one of the older albums, soft piano notes drifting through the air. I stood for a moment, watching him from the hallway. He didn't notice me at first. His focus was distant, lost in something I couldn't reach. Eventually, I stepped into the room. He looked up, and I offered him a faint smile. He returned it, not with happiness, but with understanding. That's all we could offer each other now. Not promises. Not declarations. Just this recognition. We didn't sit together that night. I took my place in the armchair, and he remained on the couch. A safe distance. But the silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of things we didn't need to say. When the music ended, I stood. He didn't rise. He simply looked at me, his eyes calm. I nodded once, and turned toward the stairs. In my room, I changed into sleepwear slowly, deliberately. I pulled the curtains, turned down the bed, dimmed the lights. I lay down with my eyes open, letting the ceiling blur into darkness. I wasn't waiting for anything. I wasn't hoping or regretting. I was simply letting the weight of everything settle into its rightful place. Somewhere downstairs, the lights clicked off. I heard the quiet creak of the guest room door. And then, nothing. I closed my eyes and listened to the stillness of the house, wondering how something so quiet could feel so loud inside me. And in that stillness, I understood, nothing had broken. But nothing would ever be the same. He returned earlier than I expected. There had been a message, brief and harmless, a change of plans, a cancelled meeting, an earlier flight. Nothing in his tone suggested suspicion or urgency. I read the text twice before setting the phone down on the kitchen counter. He would be home in the evening instead of tomorrow afternoon. I didn't panic. I didn't rush to change anything in the house. The linens were already washed, the kitchen already clean. There was nothing out of place, nothing overt. But the shift inside me was immediate. The quiet that had wrapped around these days like a protective shawl began to loosen. For a few hours, I moved as usual. I watered the garden. I folded the laundry. I made a grocery list I knew I wouldn't use. The guest room door remained closed, and the hallway between our rooms felt longer than ever before. He, the guest, was still at the library. I hadn't told him yet. I wasn't hiding the return, not really. But I hadn't offered the information either. I told myself I wanted to say it in person. That it would be better that way. When he came back, the sun had dipped low enough to turn the floors gold. He entered carrying a tote bag filled with books and set it quietly by the stairs. He looked tired in the way that students often do, pleasantly worn out, satisfied by a day of thinking. I stood in the kitchen, pretending to organize a drawer. When he walked in, our eyes met, and something flickered there, a question, maybe, or a quiet warning. I told him the news simply: my husband would be home that evening. He nodded once, slowly, and said nothing. The silence that followed was different from all the ones before it. It wasn't gentle or meditative. It was hollow. He moved toward the living room without looking back, and I remained in the kitchen, one hand still resting on the drawer that no longer needed organizing. Dinner was quiet. I cooked more than necessary: roasted vegetables, pasta, fresh bread warmed in the oven, not because I thought anyone would be hungry, but because movement was easier than stillness. He helped without being asked. He set the table, poured the water, lit the candle I forgot was even there. We sat, across from each other, in the dimming light. I couldn't taste anything. I chewed and swallowed and nodded at the right moments. His face was calm, composed, as always. But I could see the way his shoulders tensed slightly, the way he avoided resting his gaze on mine for too long. After we cleared the dishes, he excused himself and went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping the already clean counters, rinsing the sink twice. I wanted to hold on to the quiet a little longer before it changed. My husband arrived just before 8. The sound of the door opening was familiar and sharp. He called my name, casual, cheerful. I dried my hands and walked to greet him. He smiled, kissed my cheek, dropped his bag with a heavy thud. I returned the smile. I asked about the trip. I listened. I nodded. I filled a glass with water and handed it to him. He didn't ask about the guest. He assumed everything had gone as expected. He asked if dinner had already happened, and I said yes, but there was plenty left if he wanted some. He declined, said he'd eaten at the airport. I showed him to the bedroom, helped him unpack. We talked about delays, about work, about the neighbor's new dog that barked all night. Not once did he ask how I had been. Later, when I passed by the guest room, the door was shut. No sound from inside. I didn't knock. I didn't speak. I simply stood there for a moment, hand hovering near the frame, then moved on. That night, the house held too many layers. My husband's voice in one room, familiar footsteps, old rhythms sliding back into place as though they had never been interrupted. But I had changed. I knew it. I could feel it in the way I responded to him, still kind, still attentive, but different. Not cold. Just distant in a way I couldn't explain without revealing too much. We lay in bed together, but the silence now was foreign. It wasn't peace. It was weight. His breathing beside me was steady, even. Mine was not. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind press against the windows. Every now and then, I heard a creak from the hallway, small, insignificant, but enough to tighten something in my chest. Sleep didn't come. In the early hours, I went downstairs and made tea. I sat in the dark kitchen with the mug between my hands, staring at nothing. I thought about the guest room, about the person behind that door. I wondered if he was asleep. If he would say goodbye tomorrow. If we would look at each other for the last time and understand what was left unspoken. When the sun began to rise, I opened the back door and stepped into the garden. The grass was wet. The air smelled like memory. I breathed deeply, not to calm myself, but to feel something real. Something I could trust. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sorry. But I understood fully, finally, that I had walked across a line that could not be uncrossed. Not because of shame, and not because of fear. But because I had found something, briefly, that I had forgotten was possible. And now I would have to carry that truth in silence. The morning after his return passed like any other. The ordinariness of it all was the most jarring part. The smell of coffee. The soft hum of the refrigerator. The dull clink of my husband's spoon against the edge of his bowl. I watched him from across the table, not studying him, not analyzing, but simply observing. He hadn't changed. Why would he? The only thing different in the room was me. He spoke of flights and emails, of someone named Martin who had forgotten a report. I nodded at the right times, asked short questions to keep the rhythm going. He didn't notice the pauses in my voice or the way my fingers curled slightly under the tablecloth. Or if he did, he didn't ask. I knew the guest would be leaving soon. It hadn't been said, but I could feel it. The energy of departure is its own kind of presence. Lighter steps. Fewer words. The absence begins before the body leaves. My husband left for the office mid-morning, promising to be home late. As the door closed behind him, the silence settled differently. It didn't wrap around me with softness or welcome. It just hung there, static and bare. I made tea and stood in the hallway outside the guest room. I almost knocked, but didn't. Instead, I returned to the kitchen and waited. Eventually, I heard the soft movements upstairs, drawers opening, the creak of the closet. A suitcase unzipping. When he came down, he was already dressed for travel. Not hurried, but ready. He didn't carry his things yet, just a folded jacket in one hand. Our eyes met in the kitchen, and we stood there in that familiar distance, the space we had built and broken and rebuilt over days without meaning to. He said he would be going in an hour or so. His tone was calm. I nodded, not asking where, not offering to drive him. We both understood the shape of this moment. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't coldness. It was simply what had to happen. I offered him something to eat, and he declined gently. I didn't insist. He sat down at the table anyway, across from me, his hands folded loosely. I poured more tea for myself. Neither of us touched the silence. After a while, I spoke, not of what had happened, not of what we had become, but of something smaller. I told him that I had once wanted to study architecture too, long ago, before life swept in with its larger plans. He looked up with surprise, then smiled, not because it was funny, but because it made sense. Like a puzzle piece he hadn't realized was missing. He didn't respond with a story of his own. He just nodded once, with a kind of reverence, as if to say, I see you. And in that moment, I felt something loosen in me, not grief, not regret, just the tension of holding a secret that no longer needed to be hidden. We talked briefly about the weather, about the train schedule. He told me there was a transfer in the city. I asked how long the trip would be. Our words were careful, gentle. Not avoiding, not pretending, just offering each other a soft place to land before goodbye. He went upstairs after that to finish packing. I stayed downstairs, cleaning surfaces that were already clean, wiping windows that didn't need it. I needed something to do with my hands. I needed the motion. When he came down again with his bag, I was in the hallway, folding a blanket that had lived on the couch since before he arrived. We looked at each other, not directly, but fully. There was nothing else to say. He thanked me, not for the room, or the meals, or the hospitality, but for something deeper. I don't remember the exact words. Maybe there weren't any. Maybe it was just the way he looked at me, the way his voice softened. At the door, I reached for the handle but stopped short. He opened it instead. The sunlight was bright, and he squinted slightly as he stepped onto the porch. I followed, pausing at the threshold. The air smelled like warmed wood and distant flowers. He turned, and for a second, I thought he might say something more. A final sentence to hold on to. But he didn't. He just nodded once, slowly, and walked down the path. I watched him all the way to the corner. He didn't look back. When I closed the door, the house didn't feel heavier. It didn't feel emptier. It felt still. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I took a walk. I called a friend I hadn't spoken to in months and asked about her garden. I sat in the living room and read a book, not absorbing the words, but letting them hold me in place. My husband came home late, as promised. He was tired. He kissed my cheek. He asked if everything had been fine while he was gone. I said yes. He didn't ask more. That night, lying beside him in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt the familiar shape of his breath beside me. I wasn't restless. I wasn't sad. I was simply awake. I thought of the guest room, now empty again. I thought of the small notebook he had left behind, the one with his name scribbled on the inside cover. I hadn't opened it. I wouldn't. Some truths don't need witnesses. They just need to be felt. In the morning, I watered the plants, opened the windows, folded the laundry. Life did not fall apart. But something had shifted quietly and permanently. And I would carry that with me, not as a burden, not as a wound, but as a quiet proof that I had been seen. That I had wanted. That I had lived.